Good evening, friends. The subject of my talk this evening is self-effort and divine grace. I chose this subject at the request of one of our devotees. She requested me to give a talk on this subject, self-effort and divine grace. Well, in Hinduism, there is a doctrine called the doctrine of karma, or doctrine of action and its effect. That is, whatever action a person performs, its effect will be there. Sometimes the effect is immediate, sometimes it is delayed. If a person puts his hand into fire, that is an action, and then he gets the effect immediately. His hand gets burnt. But if he plants an apple sapling in his courtyard, then it may take several years for the apple sapling to become a fully grown tree and yield apples. So the result of that action will be a delayed action, a delayed result. And in Hinduism, according to the doctrine of cause and effect, or doctrine of karma as it is called, karma is action, the idea is given that people are responsible for whatever happens to them in the form of pleasure or pain. Those are the effects of their past or present actions. And sometimes the result comes later, that is, as I have already explained to you. They are like term deposits in banks. You deposit some money at a certain rate of interest, dividend, for 5 years. After 5 years, you can get back that money. Until then, the money will be at the bank. So also some of your actions are late bearing. Their effects are late bearing. But every action will have an effect, either good or bad. So what is the role of God in this area? Our scriptures say that God is the giver of the fruits of our action. Fruits of our action. We may perform action and there will be results, but the results will be given by God. God is like the cashier in a bank. The cashier cannot give any money to the depositor other than his invested capital and its interest. So now the question may arise, where then is the scope of God's grace in Hinduism? If everything happens according to the effects of one's actions, then what is the scope for God's grace in Hinduism? Hinduism says God's grace is not conditional. Any conditional gift cannot be called real grace. God showers His impartial grace on everyone, whether good or bad, rich or poor. Those who are good use God's grace for good purposes, and those who are not good, they use God's grace for bad purposes. That's how it is. So some examples should be given. Consider a lamp. It is casting light. and the lamp is burning in a particular room, and then a person is reading a holy book with the help of the light of that lamp. It could be a candle or whatever. Candle is casting, well-lit candle casts light. And with the help of that, a person is reading a holy book. But in the same room, close by, another person is forging dollar bills with the help of that light. This light is like God's grace. It is meant for all. It is impartial. So the person who is reading the holy book, eventually he may become a saint, experience divinity. The other person who is forging dollar bills, it is quite probable that he will go to jail someday. So, God's grace is impartial, but the people who use God's grace, they may use it for a good purpose, or maybe another person may use it for a bad purpose. Another analogy is given by Sri Ramakrishna, a divine incarnation. According to him, every person is like the owner of a sailboat in this world. But the owner of the sailboat has to use oars also to make this boat move. Sri Ramakrishna says, but the breeze of God's grace is always blowing. If the boatman wants to take the help of that breeze, then that person has to put up the sails of that boat. He has to put up a sail. And then the wind of God's grace will start pushing that boat, not before that. So, this is a very good example. That is, every person owns a sailboat and he has to row the boat when the sails are not there. But if he puts up the sail of the boat, then some strong breeze may move that boat and he doesn't have to row the boat anymore. And the boatman will be moved according to the direction of the wind. That means that wind is God's grace or God's will. So such a person will say, everything that is happening to me is happening according to God's will. I told you a story at another time about a weaver who spent a lot of time in thinking of God, and his mind became transformed into a very pure mind. And then he could realize that everything that is being done by God, by God's will. So when people would come to his shop, he would say, by God's will, the price of the cloth is this much. And by God's will, the profit should be only this much. like that. So by seeing his honesty, many people would go to his shop and buy cloth. One day this man was sitting on the front porch of his house at night, and enjoying some fresh air. At that time, a group of burglars was passing by. And one member of that group had fallen ill. That member used to carry the burglarized things which would be put in a large sack. And they were looking for someone like that, and they found this man sitting on the porch. They knew this man to be a good man, and they sort of asked him to come and accompany them. And he accompanied those burglars, and the burglars entered a large home and stole many valuable things and put them in a large sack. Then, meanwhile, the owners had come to know that their house is being burglarized, and they had informed the police, and the police came, and the burglars escaped. But this man who was to carry that load, large sack containing those burglarized things, he was caught by the police. So this weaver was taken to the jail, and then from there he was taken to the judge. And the people were surprised to hear that such a good soul was involved in committing burglary. So they also came in a large number to the court. And the judge asked that man, why did you go to steal those things? Then he said, by the will of God I was sitting there, and by the will of God these burglars came. By the will of God they sort of forced me to go with them. By the will of God I entered the house of that gentleman, and by the will of God they stole many things and put those things in that large sack. And by the will of God they were forcing me to carry that sack, on putting that sack on my back. And then by the will of God the police came, and the burglars escaped, and I was arrested. And by the will of God I have been brought before you. And meanwhile the other people, they also started saying to the judge, he is a very honest man, he can never steal. And the judge also could see that, and the judge released that weaver. And the weaver came back to his shop, and then he said, by the will of God the judge released me, and by the will of God I am back to my shop. Everything according to God's will, because he is like a boatman whose boat has sails, and those sails are being driven by that wind which is divine grace. So whatever is happening in his life, according to him, that is happening according to God's will or God's grace. So this is a very good story. And those who have followed the path of devotion using God's grace, they eventually experience divinity. Like this weaver, they experience divinity. And Sri Ramakrishna was a divine incarnation. He could not use the word I because he had experienced that he was always aware of his own divinity, so his body was not the divinity. So that's why he could not use the word I. He would often use the word this to mean his body. Or his mind also. This did that. He would replace the word I with the pronoun this. That's what he used to do. So, self-effort and divine grace, that is the subject of my talk. So divine grace is always there for us. We have to take advantage of that grace. And as long as we have our ego, that may create problem. It is ego of a person which makes a person a thief, a burglar, or a murderer. And then again, it is the ego of a person which makes a person a pious man. Once a young boy came to me here. He was wearing something like a robe. Then I said to him, "What is that you are wearing?" Then he turned around, and behind that robe, it was a red robe, and a big capital letter S was written. Then he turned around and said, "I am Superman." That boy was how old? Maybe 6 years old or 5 years old, I don't know. "I am Superman," he said. Then he went on telling, "I can fly through the air. I can kill elephants, tigers, lions." He was telling all those things. He was imagining actually. I doubted whether he could kill even a fly. But he was telling that he was Superman. So there are some people who are like that boy. They think, "Oh, I am Superman." And in order to be a Superman, they needed many things. "Oh, I need a large house, I need this, I need that." And then they'll take recourse to all kinds of dishonest practices to attain that thing. Yes. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, most people are in bondage in this world because they crave lustful things and they crave money. These two cravings enslave people, he used to say, in this world. So they cannot take advantage of God's grace. Had they taken the advantage of God's grace, then they would have experienced divinity. And there is no higher experience than experiencing divinity. In divinity there is no suffering, no so-called enjoyment. There is peace. In this world of time, space and causation, there are so many limitations. There is suffering and enjoyment. This world is also called the world of pairs of opposites. If a person knows suffering, that person must know what is enjoyment, and vice versa. If a person knows what is good, that person will also know what is bad. But the understanding of what is good and what is bad will depend upon that person only. at the root of all trouble, if we analyze, is our ego. I've said that many times, but I'll say that again. The ego is a thought of our conscious mind, I. So the owner and the object owned cannot be the same. We know that. If I own a house, I cannot be that house. If I own a car, I cannot be that car. What about my body? I own my body. Therefore, I cannot be my body. I own my senses, so I cannot be my senses. I own my mind, so I cannot be my mind also. But somehow, some complication is there in regard to the mind. Because the idea of a person's individual existence is a thought of that person's conscious mind. And that thought is I. Like that boy who said, I am Superman. His I was responsible for that. His ego. It is the ego. But we are not really the ego. That's what the scriptures of Hinduism try to teach us again and again and again. You are not the ego. As I have said many times before, I belong to the Ramakrishna Order of monks, which is called in India Ramakrishna Mission. And one young man came and joined the order, and an elderly Swami started talking to him and said to him, do you know or rather asked him, do you know the name of the order which you have joined? And the young man said, yes sir, revered sir, I know it. What is it? It is Ramakrishna Mission. And the elderly Swami said, no, it is not Ramakrishna Mission. It is Ramakrishna Machine. What kind of machine? Ego-crushing machine. The ego that you have, it has to be crushed. And when the ego is gone, then divinity will remain. Every person equipped with his or her ego is like a wave in the infinite ocean of divinity. And the mind is a wave. So as long as a person identifies with his or her mind, that person has the ego. If the ego is gone, then only oceanness will remain. The waves are no other than the ocean. So, divine grace is there. The wind is always blowing. Let us put up the sails of our boat and stop rowing the boat. Then the wind will move the boat. And that is submitting to divine grace. Divine grace. By divine grace we will get to know that we are divinity. Yes. Our false ego will go away and the real ego will appear. That real ego is no other than transcendental divinity. There was at least one Swami in our order. Before his death, some Swamis were around him, other monks. Then he said, I am that Brahman, I am that divinity. He had done a lot of spiritual practice in his life, it looks like. Then again, I've seen a few monks, not many, who are highly educated and everything. One of them was the principal of one of our colleges in India. And for some reason, he had a big ego. He could not get rid of his ego. And it is this ego which made him think that he was somebody, but he was supposed to be nobody. And he left the order, went and started something, I do not know what he did. That poor monk had a wonderful opportunity to experience divinity having been in the order, but his ego did not allow him. So, divine grace, we should make, if at all we have to make our self-effort, then let us make self-effort to crush and demolish our ego. And then the divine wind of divine grace will start moving us. Then we will be like that weaver. Everything happens according to the will of God. Thank you so much for your patience. I have been here for about 46 or 47 years. And when I came here first, I started the Interfaith Council of Washington State, Interfaith Movement. Because our order, the Ramakrishna Order, believes in interfaith harmony. At that time, many got to know me, and many teachers of schools and colleges would invite me to speak on Hinduism in their classes. And we don't charge anything because it is against our religious tradition to charge any money for giving talks or discourses. I wrote a book, this book actually, The Essentials of Hinduism. And you wouldn't believe it, since its publication in the United States, about 17,000 copies have been sold. Mostly the universities and colleges and schools, they buy this book. The teachers, they buy. And in India also, this book has been published by one of our publication centers, which is in Mylapore, that means previously what used to be known as Madras. And many thousand copies of this book have been sold in India as well. It is very interesting that the book is selling itself. And one Korean publisher somehow came to know about this book, and that publisher has published this book, Essentials of Hinduism, in Korean language. And this book has been translated into 1 or 2 Indian languages as well. So it looks like the book has been serving its purpose. One beauty of this book is that most of the questions that may come to your mind about Hinduism have been answered by this book.